Imagine a game where you're not a chosen one, just an ordinary engineer who believes everything can be explained with logic. And then you end up in a place where logic completely breaks. You discover a cult, not outcasts, but the elite, wealthy, powerful people worshiping something ancient and alien, performing sacrifices, even involving children. But that's not the worst part. The more you understand their beliefs, the more it changes you. Not metaphorically, literally. Reality cracks. Your body and mind stop feeling like your own. And the real nightmare? You're the only one who saw it. No witnesses, no proof. When you tell the truth, they call you insane, a paranoid. Your trauma becomes a weapon against you, and eventually, you don't even know what's real anymore. And here's the thing, you don't have to imagine it. This game exists. It's Dead Space. Back in 2007, it was already talking about corrupted elites, closed communities, and how truth can be erased by calling it madness. Despite success, Electronic Arts tried to kill it twice, turning it into just another space horror. But that's exactly why it survived. Dead Space does not open with a monster. It opens with a lie. Before the first necromorph tears through a corridor wall, before Isaac Clarke ever picks up a plasma cutter, the universe of Dead Space is already infected, not by alien biology, but by organized belief weaponized against human will. The Unitology Church, the dominant religious institution in Dead Space's 26th century, is the game's true antagonist. The necromorphs are merely its product. And the more carefully you examine how Unitology actually functions, its recruitment strategies, its class structure, its relationship to power, its use of children, and the specific psychological profile of the people it targets, the harder it becomes to pretend you are looking at science fiction. Unitology was founded on the discovery of an alien artifact called the Marker, unearthed on Earth in the 21st century. Its theology promises unity with a higher intelligence and resurrection of the dead. Its founder, Michael Altman, preached transformation and transcendence. What the Church conceals from its lower ranks, and what Dead Space's narrative slowly, brutally reveals, is that the Marker is not a gift. It is a trigger mechanism for a transformation process designed to gather more mass for an alien intelligence. The Church knows this, at least its upper echelons do, and they proceed anyway. This is the first and most essential parallel to Scientology, and to the broader architecture of how high control groups actually operate. L. Ron Hubbard's Church of Scientology is famously structured around a tiered system of revelation. You do not learn what Scientology actually teaches at the core, the cosmology of Xenu, Phaetons, alien souls trapped in volcanoes, until you have spent years and tens of thousands of dollars ascending through operating Phaeton levels. The deeper you go, the more you are told. And critically, the more you have invested, the more psychologically and financially committed you are, making departure exponentially more costly at every stage. Unitology is structurally identical. The average Unitologist is a person afraid of death who is offered continuity. They are not told about the markers. They are not told about the necrotic transformation process. They are recruited on the language of science, of discovery, of alien intelligence, of confirmed extraterrestrial contact, and then slowly guided inward. The revelation deepens in proportion to their investment and compliance. By the time a Unitologist learns what the Marker actually does, they have been so thoroughly reshaped by the cult's logic that they greet the information not with horror, but with ecstasy. Doctors, lawyers, and true believers. The elite core of Unitology. Here is where the Dead Space franchise does something that most horror games, most horror franchises of any medium, refuse to do. It insists with considerable specificity that the people most deeply embedded in Unitology are not the credulous poor, not the desperate, not the obviously unstable. They are the educated, the professionally accomplished, the wealthy. Unitology's inner circle across the 3 games and the expanded universe materials includes politicians, military officers, corporate executives, and scientists. The EarthGov military in Dead Space 2 is deeply compromised by Unitologist infiltration. Unitologist assets occupy positions at CEC, the mining corporation that employs Isaac, at the highest levels. Director Hans Tiedemann, the antagonist of Dead Space 2, is a government official who has been running illegal marker research with full knowledge of what the markers do. This is not incidental world building. This is the game's most sophisticated argument. Unitology does not persist because the uneducated masses accept its theology uncritically. It persists because the most rational-seeming stratum of society, people who would publicly identify as empiricists, as skeptics, as realists, have been absorbed into it. And they have been absorbed precisely because Unitology does not present itself as religion in the traditional sense. It presents itself as the logical conclusion of confirmed alien contact. It speaks the language of evidence. It appeals to the kind of person who prides themselves on following the data wherever it leads. The very intellectual vanity that makes someone resistant to conventional religious claims makes them, in some ways, more vulnerable to a cult that speaks fluent scientific rationalism. This is an exact description of how Scientology recruits. Scientology famously targets high achievers, celebrities, business executives, lawyers, doctors, because they are both financially valuable and socially influential. The initial pitch is framed as self-improvement technology, not spirituality. Dianetics presents itself as a form of applied psychology. The religious dimension emerges gradually. By the time a recruit understands the full cosmological architecture they have signed on to, they have already been through extensive auditing sessions that have revealed their deepest vulnerabilities, fears, and shameful memories, all of which are on record and can be used as leverage. This is not coincidence. This is the blueprint. High-control groups that survive and scale do so by targeting influence networks, not just individuals. They do not waste their primary energy on converting the powerless. They identify the people who make decisions, in media, in government, in law, in medicine, and they convert those people first. The downstream effect is protection. The downstream effect is that when survivors attempt to speak publicly, the institutions that should amplify those voices have already been compromised. The initiation of children and the Epstein parallel. Dead Space 2, the most critically and commercially successful entry in the series, is set on the Sprawl, a vast civilian station orbiting Saturn's moon, Titan. It is a city. It has schools, hospitals, apartment blocks. It has children. Early in Chapter 6 of Dead Space 2, players can find a Unitologist meeting room. Inside, on a standard corporate-style presentation display, are a series of slides. They document an initiation ceremony. The subject of the initiation is a small girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. The slides show adult men of obvious wealth and status standing around her in Unitologist ceremonial dress. The girl is being welcomed into the church. The framing is presented as celebratory, as an honor, as a gift being bestowed upon this child by these important men. This sequence is not a cutscene. It is environmental storytelling, the kind Dead Space does better than almost any franchise in gaming history. You can walk past it. Most players do. But if you stop and look, if you engage with what the game has placed in that room and what it is actually depicting, you are looking at something deeply specific and deeply uncomfortable. You are looking at the ritualized induction of a child into a hierarchical organization by adult men who hold power over that child's world, documented with the clinical pride of a church newsletter. This sequence gained renewed relevance, to put it mildly, after the partial release of the Jeffrey Epstein court documents. Epstein operated a trafficking network that served wealthy and powerful men from politics, finance, academia, and entertainment. The victims were disproportionately minors, many of them groomed through promises of opportunity and connection. The operation was sustained for decades, not despite its participants' prominence, but because of it. The prosecutors who should have prosecuted, the journalists who should have investigated, the institutions that should have intervened. Many were either compromised, afraid, or simply unwilling to believe that the people they knew socially and professionally were capable of what the evidence showed. The Epstein documents did not create the conspiracy theory. They confirmed it. Every person who had publicly argued for years that Epstein was running a politically connected child trafficking operation was, by the standards of polite discourse, a conspiracy theorist. They were dismissed. They were mocked. They were accused of being unhinged. And then the documents came out, and the visitor logs, and the flight records, and suddenly the unhinged conspiracy theorists were the only people who had been telling the truth. Dead Space 2 placed that initiation slideshow in Chapter 6 in 2011. Visceral Games was not making a documentary, but they were doing what the best speculative fiction has always done. They were taking a structural logic that exists in reality and following it to its conclusion within a fictional frame. The Unitologist Church is not an allegory for a single real-world institution. It is an allegory for the principle, demonstrated repeatedly throughout history and documented with new clarity in the Epstein papers, that organized abuse at the elite level is sustained by the same structures that make elite institutions appear trustworthy. Isaac Clarke, the rational man in the irrational nightmare. Isaac Clarke's name is not an accident. The reference points are Arthur C. Clarke, the British science fiction author and futurist who wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey and coined Clarke's 3 laws, the most famous of which states that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, the latter being an additional nod embedded in the dual name structure. Isaac Clarke is nominally named after 2 men who spent their careers at the intersection of science and the speculative. He is, in every sense the game can communicate, a man defined by his relationship to the material and the rational. He is an engineer, not a soldier, not a scientist, not a philosopher, an engineer. The professional category most dedicated to the practical application of physical laws, to making things that work according to understood principles, to solving problems by understanding systems. Isaac Clarke fixes things. He reroutes power conduits and repairs oxygen generators and welds breech seals. He is competent in the specific, material, physical sense of the word. And he is completely unprepared, in every way that a rational, practically minded person is unprepared, for what he encounters on the USG Ishimura. There is a particular species of horror that is uniquely available to the rationalist. It is not the horror of the supernatural, per se. It is the horror of discovering that your framework for understanding reality was not just incomplete, but actively, strategically maintained as incomplete by forces that benefited from your ignorance. The religious person who loses their faith experiences grief. The rationalist who discovers that the conspiracy theories they dismissed were literally true experiences, something closer to a structural collapse. The ground itself becomes unreliable. Isaac Clarke spends 3 games in this state. He does not convert to mysticism. He does not suddenly become a believer in the theological content of Unitology. He continues throughout to approach the markers as engineering problems, the necromorphs as biological threats, the church as a criminal organization. He is right about all of this, and none of it is sufficient to protect him, because the scale of what he is confronting, the depth of institutional compromise, the length of time this has been going on, the number of people who knew and said nothing is beyond the coping capacity of a framework built on the assumption that institutions are, more or less, what they appear to be. This is the experience of the whistleblower. This is the experience of the investigator who pursues a story that powerful people do not want told. This is the experience of every person who looked at the Epstein situation, at the obvious evidence, at the pattern, at the names, and attempted to communicate what they were seeing to people whose professional and social identity was invested in the legitimacy of the institutions those names represented. The problem was never the evidence. The problem was that the evidence required its audience to accept a conclusion that restructured everything they thought they understood about how power works and who exercises it. The man who saw it first parallels to Dead Space 2's Mad Prophet. Dead Space 2 introduces a character named Nolan Strauss, a scientist who was involved in marker research and who has been driven, by prolonged exposure to marker signals, to a state of visible instability. He communicates in fragments. He references things Isaac doesn't understand yet. He is coded throughout the early game as the game's obligatory madman, the unreliable narrator whose warnings must be filtered through the awareness that he is not entirely functional. He is also correct about essentially everything. The specific details that Strauss delivers in his fractured, disturbing way about the marker's purpose, about what CEC and EarthGov knew and when, about the nature of the transformation process, about the existence of a unifying intelligence behind the necromorph phenomenon. All of it is confirmed. He was not wrong. He was not delusional. He had information that the institutions around him had worked very hard to classify, suppress, and discredit, and his exposure to that information in an uncontrolled way had damaged him, and that damage was then used as grounds to dismiss everything he was saying. This is the mechanism by which genuine whistleblowers are neutralized without having to engage the substance of their testimony. You do not have to disprove what someone is saying if you can establish that the person saying it is unstable. The instability itself becomes the story. The instability itself crowds out the content of the testimony. And in many real cases, the instability is a direct product of what the person witnessed and what was done to them as a result of witnessing it, which creates the perfect, self-sealing logic of institutional protection. The experience that made you a credible witness is the same experience that destroys your credibility. Strauss saw the truth. He was institutionalized. He was studied. He was treated as a subject rather than a source. And by the time Isaac meets him, he is exactly what the people who had him institutionalized needed him to be. A man whose testimony can be safely ignored by anyone who prefers to ignore it. Mutation as initiation, the literal body horror of institutional corruption. One of Dead Space's most philosophically elegant design choices is the literalization of corruption as physical transformation. The necromorphs, the game's primary enemies, are not alien. They are humans and animals who have been reanimated and transformed by the marker's signal into new biological configurations designed to serve the marker's purpose. They are, in the most direct possible sense, what people become when they give themselves entirely to the thing Unitology worships. The Church's inner circle knows this. They pursue it anyway. In fact, for the highest-level Unitologists, the witnesses, the inner circle members who have access to the true doctrine, the transformation is not a threat to be avoided. It is the promised transcendence. It is what the Church has been building toward. The mutation is the initiation. The monster is the saint. This is a horror game, making a sophisticated argument about the nature of institutional corruption over time. In any organization that operates through tiered revelation and demands increasing sacrifice at each level, there comes a point of no return. A point at which the initiate has compromised themselves so thoroughly, has participated in so many violations of their prior ethical framework, has absorbed so much of the institution's logic in place of their own, that what began as membership has become identity. They are not merely in the organization, they are, in a meaningful sense, made of it. Their prior self has been converted into something that serves the organization's purposes. The Unitologist who started out seeking comfort in the face of grief and ended up standing in a room watching a child being initiated into a cult she cannot consent to joining is not, at that point, the same person who walked into their first recruitment meeting. Something has been progressively dismantled and replaced. The outer form may look similar, but the interior architecture has been rebuilt according to a different logic, one that makes acts that would have previously been unthinkable not only thinkable, but sanctified. Dead Space makes this literal. It puts it in the body. It puts it in the flesh. It lets you look at what a person becomes, rendered in bone and sinew, when they give everything to a thing that was never what it claimed to be. EA, the publisher, and the systematic suppression of the wrong kind of horror. Electronic Arts acquired Visceral Games, then known as EA Redwood Shores, in 1998. Dead Space was developed under their roof and published under their label in 2008. From EA's perspective, the marketing calculus was straightforward. Resident Evil 4 had been one of the most critically and commercially successful games of the decade. Dead Space had a third-person, over-the-shoulder perspective, a dark aesthetic, and monsters. It was, from a marketing standpoint, Resident Evil 4 in space. That was the pitch. That was the positioning. That was what the trailers communicated and what the promotional materials emphasized. This was not incorrect, it was simply not what Dead Space was actually about. And the gap between those two things, between what EA sold the game as and what the game actually was, created a structural misalignment that would afflict the franchise for the entirety of its commercial lifespan. Dead Space's strengths are not its combat. Its combat is functional and often tense, but the dismemberment mechanic, while innovative, is a system, not an experience. What makes Dead Space extraordinary is its world, its lore, its environmental storytelling, and the specific intellectual and emotional coherence of its central horror. This is a game about systems of power that corrupt and consume, about the violence done to ordinary people by institutions that serve themselves, about the experience of being a rational person in a world where the things you were told were crazy turn out to be true. These are not things that translate easily into a 30-second trailer. EA's approach to the series was to treat it as an action horror property that needed to be made more accessible with each iteration. Dead Space 2 tightened the combat, increased the spectacle, added multiplayer, which no one asked for and which was quietly dropped for the third game. Dead Space 3 introduced microtransactions, dropped most of the horror atmosphere in favor of third-person action shooter mechanics, and added a co-op mode that fundamentally undermined the series' central design principle of isolation. By the time Dead Space 3 shipped in 2013, EA had successfully transformed the franchise into a version of itself that had almost none of its distinctive qualities, and had somehow also failed to capture the audience for the more mainstream action games it was imitating. The series was put on ice after Dead Space 3's disappointing sales. Visceral Games was subsequently closed by EA in 2017, publicly explained as a consequence of the declining market for single-player games. The timing coincided with EA's intensive internal focus on games as a service and live service monetization, which Dead Space, a narrative single-player franchise with specific, considered themes, was constitutionally unable to become. What is particularly sharp about this trajectory is the way EA's marketing managed consistently to undersell the element of Dead Space that was most likely to generate devoted, long-term engagement: the ideas. Resident Evil 4, the game Dead Space was perpetually positioned against, is an enormously well-crafted game, but it does not have a philosophy. It does not have a thesis about how power works, about who serves whom, about what institutions do to the people who trust them. Dead Space has all of these things, and they are not incidental flavor. They are load-bearing elements of the experience. When EA's marketing stripped them away in favor of positioning the game as a combat-forward horror shooter, it did not just misrepresent the game to consumers. It actively discouraged the kind of player who would have responded most strongly to what the game actually was. The cult classic and what that phrase actually means. Dead Space is a cult game. This fact is routinely presented as a lament by fans and a commercial finding by analysts. But the specific nature of its cult status deserves more attention than it typically receives because it is not arbitrary. Dead Space did not become a cult game despite its themes. It became a cult game because of them. A cult following, in the cultural sense, clusters around works that create the experience of being seen, of having something recognized and articulated that the mainstream discourse had not named. Rocky Horror is a cult film because it offered specific recognition to specific people who had nowhere else to see themselves. The Big Lebowski is a cult film because it offered a philosophical worldview that resonated with people who found mainstream aspiration narratives hollow. Fight Club, for all its subsequent misappropriations, is a cult film because it articulated something about masculinity, consumption, and institutional alienation that its audience felt and had not previously seen rendered with such precision. Dead Space's cult following is not comprised primarily of people who love survival horror. It is comprised of people who responded to the specific experience of watching a rational man, named after rationalists, discover that the conspiracy theorists were right, and that the institutions he trusted were complicit, and that the monsters he is fighting used to be people who trusted those institutions too. The rationalizing class and its particular vulnerability. There is one more parallel worth drawing explicitly because it touches the deepest structural element of both the Dead Space universe and the real-world landscape it mirrors. The Unitologist Church's most important and most overlooked achievement is not its theology. It is not its rituals, its hierarchy, or its promised afterlife. Its most important achievement is the specific profile of person it targets and the specific vulnerability it exploits. Unitology targets people who believe they are immune to manipulation by religion. It targets the atheist physician, the agnostic corporate lawyer, the secular scientist. It offers them something that does not require them to surrender their self-image as rational actors. It offers them confirmed alien contact, the most scientifically verifiable supernatural claim possible, and then builds the entire apparatus of a high control group on top of that legitimate foundation. The people most confident in their immunity to irrational belief systems are not, empirically, the people least vulnerable to them. They are frequently among the most vulnerable, because their confidence leads them to skip the skeptical scrutiny they would apply to an obviously religious claim, because their professional networks are the ones that high control groups specifically target, and because their need to maintain the self-image of the rational actor means they will rationalize deeper and deeper into the organization's logic rather than accepting that they have been deceived. This is what the Epstein network understood. The network was not populated primarily by people who thought of themselves as criminals. It was populated by people who thought of themselves as pragmatists, as people who understood how the world really worked, as people who had transcended the naive ethical frameworks that constrained ordinary people. The ability to participate in what they participated in required a specific architecture of self-belief, and that architecture was not incompatible with high professional achievement, with intellectual sophistication, with the social performance of reasonableness and probity. It was, in many cases, enabled by it. Isaac Clarke goes through 3 games dismantling what this architecture produces, cutting apart the monsters that used to be people who believed they were ascending, destroying the markers that were sold as gifts and function as detonators, surviving the collapse of the institutional framework that was supposed supposed to protect him and instead tried to use him. He does this without becoming a crusader, without becoming a symbol, without becoming anything other than an engineer trying to solve problems in a universe that has stopped making sense by the rules he was given. He is not special. He has no powers beyond competence and endurance. He does not receive enlightenment. He receives damage. He receives the particular and unglamorous understanding that comes from surviving something that was not supposed to be survivable, not because of destiny, but because he refused, at each possible moment, to stop moving forward. That refusal, ordinary, stubborn, graceless, is the game's real thesis. Not about monsters, not about religion, not about alien intelligence or the nature of consciousness, about what it costs an ordinary person to be right about something that the powerful need them to be wrong about, and what it looks like to keep functioning anyway. Dead Space never sold what it was actually selling. EA never understood what it had made. And the audience that understood it, that found in Isaac Clarke's specific nightmare the architecture of a horror they recognized from the actual world, kept the franchise alive through years of commercial underperformance and 2 publisher-inflicted deaths, waiting, with the particular patience of people who know they are right about something no one wants to hear, for the rest of the world to catch up.